What is empathy? The capacity to feel with others is central to our thinking about ethics, education, social life, and politics. And empathy, of course, is at the core of the humanities. But like all important cultural ideas and keywords, empathy has a history, and in this case, a surprising one. Where does the concept of empathy come from? Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and today I am joined by Joe Metz, Associate Professor of German and Cultural Studies at the University of Utah's Department of World Languages and Cultures. Joe has just published a wonderful, surprising history of the idea of empathy called The Feeling of Form, Empathy in Aesthetics, from Buchner to Rilke, from the Cornell University Press. I'm delighted to welcome Joe, and I'm delighted to hear more about the cultural history of empathy. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is a great book. It's deeply researched, really fascinating, and covers a lot of territory. And it starts from the origins of the very concept of empathy in German culture in the 19th century. Could you just give us a brief outline of the concerns of the book and where empathy comes from?
Right. So this is actually a very interesting history. A lot of people don't know this, and that is that empathy actually was a neologism in English, a newly coined word, didn't enter the English language until 1909, and it was actually a translation from a German word that was also a neologism that wasn't coined until 1873. And the German word is Einfühlung, which literally means feeling oneself into something. It was originally a term in German art theory and aesthetic theory and had to do with human relationships with objects, particularly objects in nature, such as rocks and stones and clouds, but also works of art and abstract shapes and lines. And it migrated from that beginning through a series of developments, including what we call physiological or psychological aesthetics, and eventually ended up being translated by a Cornell psychology professor into the word empathy, which was his attempt to try to make a word that was analogous to the already existing English word sympathy. And so he went back to the ancient Greek roots and sort of made empathy, M plus pathos, feeling into, which was his attempt to translate the German word to make it sound like an already existing English word. So that's the etymology of the word, but it comes from a lot of different places, but that's a very brief etymological history.
So that's really interesting. So originally, when people were thinking about empathy, they were not actually thinking about interpersonal empathy. They were thinking about feeling with art objects.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It was coined by the art historian, art theorist Robert Vischer in 1873 in his dissertation on the optical sense of form. And in that dissertation, he was really talking about the way that human beings relate to objects through sensations of the body, right? The way that the human being projects themselves or projects their emotions, projects their emotional states or their vitality, so to speak, into various objects, whether they're objects in nature or works of art. And that was the original usage of the word in German for, at least 25 years. And it became very, very popular. In fact, it became the center of one of the most popular disciplines, which was physiological aesthetics or psychological aesthetics. And only later, bit by bit, did it start to become connected with interpersonal feeling through the work of Fischer's successor, Theodor. He was the first one to sort of use the term both ways.
That's really great. So give a little, as an aesthetic category, this was about how we would respond bodily to art forms. And that was part of a new scientific kind of aesthetics in 19th century German thinking.
Yes, exactly. It has a sort of a kind of a long and interesting history. It goes back really to the 18th century, to the Age of Enlightenment, and to mid-18th century and late 18th century thinkers, particularly Kant. So Kant, as is well known, has basically developed the theory that when we interact with the world, we're not necessarily really seeing the universe as it is. We're seeing, in a way, the hardwiring of our own mind, which imposes certain categories on perception. And so, in a way, we're projecting our own mental categories onto reality and seeing their reflections sort of back at us. And this idea was massively influential in the late Enlightenment and in the beginning of Romanticism. And it sort of became the root of German idealist philosophy and sort of spread all throughout, particularly the German-speaking world, but also throughout Europe. And parallel to this, there was, European scientists, particularly German scientists, were undergoing what you could think of as the discovery of the nervous system. There was the rise of neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. All sorts of thinkers were looking at how nerves worked. And the fascinating thing was that in 1826, Johannes Müller, who was one of the most important physiologists at the time, formulated the law of specific nerve energies, which is really interesting. It basically states that when you expose the body to a stimulus, whatever it may be, the different types of sensory nerves process the stimulus in different ways appropriate to that nerve. So if you stimulate the optical nerve, it'll respond to that stimulus as a sight, as a color, or an impression that looks visual. But the very same stimulus, if you expose it to an auditory nerve, will register as sound, right? So this sort of law of specific nerve energies, a lot of physiologists took this as sort of empirical verification of Kant. They say, oh, we don't really know what real reality is. There's something out there, and we're projecting our own sensory processing of that onto the world to see what it is. So these two ideas came together, Kant and physiology, and they really kicked off this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, but this extreme interest in the notion of human projection onto the outside world. And Einfühlung, or feeling one's way into the outside world, comes along at a certain point to sort of further that, right, and start thinking about the way we imbue supposedly dead objects with human vitality by projecting our vital energies and feelings into them, so to speak.
Really interesting. And so one of the things that troubles empathy as an idea is a question of whether when I'm feeling with you, I'm feeling you or I'm feeling me. Is empathy about the feeler or is it about the object of feeling? And that seems to have existed right from the beginning. It's inherent in Kant's project.
Yes, it's a very, very complex issue, and it's been one of the things that has led to a certain amount of critique of the concept of empathy over the years. What is empathy actually doing? And here I'm thinking of interpersonal empathy. But yeah, this idea that we don't quite know where feeling is coming from. And this is, I think, especially apparent in Vischer's dissertation on the optical sense of form, because he's looking at all these instances where supposedly there are objects out there in the world, say like a rock face, a cliff, or, overhanging clouds. And he says things like, we read defiance into it. We read the cliff as sort of opposing us or taking a stance against us. But it's our projecting our emotional state into the cliff due to the sort of analogy of the way the cliff kind of looks like a human body, sort of towering above us or imposing itself on us or glowering down at us, so to speak. But the question is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Because his language becomes extremely vague. It's highly ambiguous. So at some points in his treatise, it seems as though without some form of external reference or external objects, we wouldn't even have a conception of ourselves. We somehow almost need objects as sort of a model to construct the notion of a self in the mirror of. And at other points, he says, well, objects in the world symbolize my body. They resonate with my body because they have the same upright shape or because they take on the same postures. And that, in that sense, objects sort of exist to stand for, become metaphors of, in a way, the human body or even particular organs of the body. So in his own writing, it's very unclear what is the origin of these feelings, right? Are we forming a self because we see objects, or do we first need a bodily conception in order to read objects a certain way? And it spins around and around, so to speak, in his writing. And yeah, that connects in certain ways to certain later questions or critiques of interpersonal empathy, where certain thinkers have said, well, what is empathy really doing? Do we really experience or understand the feelings of another, or are we sort of still projecting our own feelings into the place of that other and sort of really seeing ourselves. So it's really more about us and our own feelings than it is about the other. And this has a long history as well, also going back to Theodor Lipps, Robert Vischer's successor, who gets caught in all sorts of metaphorical conundrums when he tries to explain the relationship of the self to the other, when he's making that transition between looking at objects and looking at other people. He sort of carries these problems with him into that way of thinking about the other as a metaphor for the self.
Sometimes when we do cultural history, we do it in order to sort of figure out some of the dilemmas, to help us think through some of the dilemmas we have in these categories. But you're suggesting that the problems with empathy go all the way back to its very origins as a category.
Yeah, I would say so. And I mean, in a certain way, there's an even more profound question underlying this, and that is the entire conceptual framework of self and other, which essentially is almost a logical prerequisite for thinking about empathic relationships. Because in order to have the notion that you're feeling yourself into another, or that you're projecting your own feelings into another, or that there's an other out there whose feelings you might possibly experience or resonate with, both of them rest on that sort of dualistic assumption that there is such a thing as a self and there is such a thing as an other, and that they are somehow solid and separate. But I think we see already, in Kant and also in a lot of the other early theorists that lead up to early empathy theory and that then get developed in Vischer and Lipps, I think we see the extreme difficulty in keeping these categories separate, the very attempt to kind of lock down what is the self, what is the other, where do my borders end and some other person's or other objects' borders begin. These are not at all clear categories or easy decisions to make. And therefore, one underlying question is, how can we speak of empathy if we have such difficulty determining what is a self and what is an other to begin with?
And so empathy is answering a problem that it may be introducing in the very separation of self.
Yes, indeed. And one of the other things that I talk about in the book is the way in which the concept of Einfühlung, the original aesthetic sense of feeling oneself into an object or imbuing a material object with human life, also arises out of a particular historical constellation of scientific and philosophical and material events that are going on in the 19th century, because along with the philosophical issues that I already talked about, Kant and his influence and the rise of neurophysiology, one of the things that was going on at this time, particularly in the German-speaking sphere, which is where the word empathy comes from, was this massive contest in the scientific world between vitalist impulses and materialist impulses in the sciences. Basically, in German science, vitalism, which essentially suggests that the universe is sort of a living organism, a living entity, right? That you can't really separate matter from vital energies. There's not a dead thing called matter and a separate thing that is alive, but rather everything is imbued with a certain degree of life and growth and organic wholeness. This developed into a German philosophical direction called Naturphilosophie, or natural philosophy. It's a bad translation. It's a direct translation, but it doesn't really capture the tone of it. But what this basically was this belief in an organic living universe. So this was extremely popular in German Romanticism with philosophers like Schelling and others who saw the universe in this way. And then what happens is, going along with this, you have the rise of scientific materialism, which is basically arguing the opposite, right? That matter is dead. Life is just a result of chemical processes. It can be reduced just simply to dead atoms and molecules bouncing around, and everything can be explained as, the functions of the laws of dead matter. And you had scientists who were right on either side of this divide. Somebody like Johannes Müller, whom I mentioned earlier, developing the law of specific nerve energies, he thought he was a vitalist, right? He thought his project was in the service of showing the life energy of the universe. But a lot of his students said, no, what your work actually shows is the opposite, and they went on to really argue against him. So you have this massive contest going on in German science, and eventually the materialist side wins. And so by the time you get to the late 19th century, most scientists have switched over to seeing vitalism as a discredited philosophy and have sort of bought into materialism. And so at that moment, in a way, it sort of makes sense that a theory evolves to sort of re-imbue the world that has been killed off, right? Nature that has now been made dead, to re-imbue that dead nature with life energy again. And in a way, empathy, Einfühlung, is doing that. It's projecting human life into dead form. But, as we find out in the book, this becomes quite uncanny because it raises all sorts of anxieties about what it means to resurrect dead form. The project of empathy becomes a sort of Frankenstein project in a certain way.
And you do talk about one of the concerns about empathy at the beginning is whether it's a kind of possession.
Yes, and this actually leads me to how I got the idea for the book. There were really like two events that came together. One, I was just thinking about the fact that the word empathy had originally been a German word. I thought that's a very, very interesting way to think back into my own field of German studies and how this connects with German aesthetics and that sort of thing. And the other thing is I was reading about Vischer's dissertation, the original document that coins the word Einfühlung, and I came across this passage, which I just thought was so striking. Here's the passage I'm quoting from Vischer. With organic nature, empathy, Einfühlung, functions symbolically to animate a plant and to anthropomorphize an animal. Only toward other human beings does it act as a doubling of self. We are also reminded here of stories of the spontaneous resurrection of a corpse and the many legends that tell of skeletons engaged in nocturnal dances and the dead walking abroad. In medieval legends, the devil takes possession of a corpse and causes it to behave as if alive. For instance, the tale of a Parisian nobleman whom the devil seduced by animating the corpse of a beautiful girl recently hanged. And I read that and I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting, because here we have the inaugural document that's trying to sort of set forth a new aesthetic theory and talking about all of the sort of almost praising and sort of lauding this human ability to project life into form and being very enthusiastic about this. And in the middle of this treatise, right, pretty much at the center point, there's this crazy passage, right, about empathy being like devils taking possession of skeletons and the devil reanimating a corpse, and particularly the corpse of a beautiful girl recently hanged. And I thought to myself, what is symbolically at stake in this rhetoric, and what sorts of anxieties and fears and, uncanniness are at play in sort of, on the one hand, setting up and praising a new aesthetic strategy, a new aesthetic category, but simultaneously kind of unconsciously figuring that as a demonic possession, and that human ability to do this is almost like the devil taking possession of a corpse, and not just any corpse, a corpse that somebody has killed, that somebody has judicially executed. And so basically I started picking away and unpacking what's actually going on in this dissertation, and its links to the rise of materialism, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the inaugural starting point of the book.
This is really interesting cultural history, and it's a fascinating history of ideas. But your book is actually, you are a literary scholar, and you're laying out this cultural history in order to actually discuss literature, in order to discuss, in particular, Stifter and Rilke and Buchner. So explain how the book is set up. It really is a book of really wonderful and really compelling close readings of some interesting texts. And your cultural history is in the service of those readings.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting structure. I'm sort of following the term coined by the quantum physicist David Bohm, implicate order, this idea that things are not necessarily a linear history, but they're interwoven so that each point sort of reflects on and contains the whole. And you can sort of unfold the meaning of things by looking at points at disparate points in time and kind of unfolding them. So yeah, it's sort of an interweaving of close readings of literary texts and voices from sensory physiology, from early empathy theory, and from later theories of the present day, like affect theory and others, that basically interweave in this sort of tapestry or dialogue. Walter Benjamin talks about dialectical images, where different points in time can become legible only in the light of other points in time, and that's sort of the way the structure of the book works. And so, yeah, I do close readings of both Vischer's dissertation itself, the metaphors and the imagery, but also of Georg Büchner, who was a radical early 19th century playwright, but also neuroanatomist, right, who was sort of working before Vischer and struggling with a lot of the same sorts of anxieties. And I read a story fragment by him as a sort of uncanny precursor of the birth of empathy before the fact. And then I read Stifter, who was sort of slightly later than Büchner, but a mid-19th century Austrian realist novelist. And I read several of his stories as opening up a different path through empathy or Einfühlung that is less sort of riddled by the anxieties that Büchner and Vischer are presenting, and that sort of opens more of a path toward escape from those through a different conception of empathy, bodily empathy. And this anticipates later empathy theory by Vernon Lee, say, who was a British empathy theorist who worked on breath and bodily movement. And then I eventually get to Rilke, the famous 20th century poet, modernist poet, and look at the role of metaphor. So sort of closing the circle, going back to the way that in Vischer, the body and objects were metaphors of each other. When we end up with Rilke, they become what I'm calling bad metaphors. So playing on the term catachresis, or a sort of strained or in a way forced metaphor, looking at the way that in Rilke, catachresis or bad metaphor is both a metaphor that tries to force you to see like the other, a sort of forced empathy, but also a metaphor that doesn't work. It itself is strained or coerced. And in that gap or that inadequacy between the metaphor and what it's trying to describe, you don't anymore have a perfect analogy between the body and form the way you did in Vischer. You have sort of a gap. You have an inadequate metaphor. And that, in a way, opens up a sort of ethical space to not possess the other or not have the other possess you. But in that gap between metaphor and the other, you can find a sort of ethical space, a way to protect the otherness of the other while still relating to them.
And it's an ethical space, an important ethical space, because it teaches you the limits of metaphor and the limits of your own understanding, recognizing that a certain kind of humility in the face of something you can't fully understand is necessary.
Exactly. And I show that, for instance, through close reading. I look at a poem cycle by Rilke that a lot of people have not studied. In fact, it's gotten pretty much no critical attention, and look at that as a sort of strange cascade of inadequate metaphors, and how the inadequate metaphors are constantly striving both to force the reader to see like the speaker of the poem, but also thematizing the failure of that and really showing that it can't be done. And it all becomes about, in a way, the unsayability of the topic, the way that metaphor fails. And this sort of opens up this space of ethics, right, between the failure of metaphor and the otherness of the other. So, yeah, and I connect it with a bunch of other contemporary theories. So there's always this interweaving. I mean, that's, I think I would say, the methodology of the book, to interweave very close readings of literary texts with a lot of other voices from theory, physiology, etc.
And in that way, the book really has some immediate resonance for us as scholars right now in 2025. We're actually thinking about many of these questions. The otherness of the other is a really important ethical stance. It's the center of object-oriented ontology and Black feminist theory and lots of other very contemporary post-colonial theory in particular, thinking about the importance of recognizing the limits to your own understanding and, as you were saying before, the otherness of the other.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's surprising the way in which some of these older theories, whether they're the inaugural documents of empathy theory or whether they are literary texts that sort of emerged in that orbit either before or after the invention of Einfühlung, and that sort of show the forces that are at play in developing this term, the way in which they anticipate so many of these issues that are so important today. For instance, in the second part of the book, when I look at one of Stifter's stories, one of the most fascinating aspects of that story is there's a character in the story, a young girl who is a neurodivergent girl and who also suffers from a physical disability and has been traumatized by her father. And one of the things that she does in the story is she is asked, right, or partially by her father, but also later by other people, to sort of perform aesthetic texts, perform emotional texts. And she does perform them perfectly. Everybody can understand what she's saying, but she has no access to the feelings, or even though technically they're her own feelings. She's asked to write stories about her own trauma and to repeat them, and she repeats them but doesn't feel the emotions associated with them. So she becomes sort of the performance of emotion as pure formalism, as pure form. And one of the questions that the story raises is, how do other characters relate to this? How do we know when an emotion is virtual and purely formal versus how do we get access to the other's real feelings? Do we know if we're having access to the other's real feelings, or are they always in a way a form or object to us? Do we only see the external gestures, right? The metaphors of their feeling as opposed to their actual feeling. So all sorts of philosophical and ethical questions get raised by the very, very poignant and sort of striking characters, right, that appear in this story.
So that also suggests that what we think about as a progression from aesthetic Einfühlung, empathy, to interpersonal empathy never really happened. Some of the questions we have about our own sense of interpersonal empathy really depends on a certain kind of formalism almost.
Exactly. It's one of the reasons why I think of a lot of aspects of this book as sort of a ghost story, right? And it starts as a ghost story originally because a lot of the ways that Vischer talks about empathy are so uncanny, with zombies and reanimations and corpses, etc. And if you look at his actual language, that sort of anxiety and imagery gets played out throughout his writing. But basically in all of the writers that I look at, there's this constant sense of this original idea of empathy as feeling oneself into form never really goes away, right? It haunts the interpersonal, that when we return in these texts to interpersonal scenes of empathy or the development of questions of interpersonal empathy out of aesthetic empathy, we find, as you said, that the initial questions never really go away. There's always this sense that when we relate to an other, are we relating to them as a person, or are we relating to them as a form, a sort of image that we see, a metaphor of themselves, an abstract formal representation of themselves that we don't really get at what they're feeling, because what's our access to them? It's always images, it's gestures, it's the interpretation of gestures, it's language, it's the interpretation of form. So it always remains, in a way, an aesthetic question. And the question is, are we blinded into thinking that it's a transparent aesthetic question, that the metaphor equals the thing, or do we look at it more as quote unquote bad metaphor, right? That the metaphor is unequal to the thing.
Right. And that would be, this is a central question of object-oriented ontology. When I see an object, am I seeing the object for me, or am I actually seeing it in itself? And for theorists like Tim Morton, who you discuss in your book, it's really important that the object turns from us and we recognize the limits of our ability to understand or appreciate or even have basic perception of it.
Right, exactly. And yeah, in the last section of the book, I talk about the way that Rilke's poetry and a lot of the philosophical concerns that he wrestles with essentially anticipate a lot of these questions of object-oriented ontology, because in as much as he becomes a poet about bad metaphor, he becomes a poet anticipating the role of metaphor in object-oriented ontology. And if you look at, Graham Harman's book, Object-Oriented Ontology, which was sort of one of his later summary statements of the theory that he's often considered to be the founder of, he devotes a massive section of that book of looking at the way that object-oriented ontology functions through the notion of metaphor, right? That essentially whenever one sees an object, you're never really seeing the thing itself, you're seeing a particular metaphor of it as it appears to you, which sounds like Kant. And I don't want to misrepresent triple O philosophy here, because they often position themselves as anti-Kantian. But I think that as they themselves have said, what they're really doing is they're trying to break that exclusive Kantian correlation between human perception in the world. One of the things that they're saying is every object interacts with every other object according to its own set of metaphors. So it's not just me seeing the world in correlation to my metaphors. It's the cup sees the desk according to the cup's metaphor of the desk and the desk's metaphor of the cup, right? There are ways that things interact in the world that always are metaphorical. They're always partial versions of what the full object would be. So it's all about the inability to ever see the object in its totality, right? Or the other in its totality. We see a particular metaphor of it for us. And that's what I think, in a way, quote unquote, bad metaphor is about. And that's sort of the outer limit in a way of empathy. It's where a different sort of ethics comes into play in empathy.
And so the ethics, this other kind of ethics, is not based on my understanding or my grasp of the object. It's based on the impossibility of that and my recognition of that impossibility, meaning there are other things out there that, as you're saying, may be doing the same thing to me, but also which I should respect in their fundamental otherness.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I think as human beings, we sort of need both, right? We sort of need both the more traditional way that empathy is understood, namely that we're trying to feel with the other, but that at the same time, even as we try to understand or try to resonate with the world from another's point of view, that we also do recognize this other type of ethics, these limits, right? The fact that there are these gaps and that we're never fully one with the other, and that can protect us to a certain degree against possessing the other or inadvertently thinking we understand them, thinking we put ourselves in their place and thus sort of erasing their experience. And it can protect us against possession by the other, getting too sucked in to what we think is their perspective, right? So it's that balance, I think, between the more traditional understanding of empathy and this more gappy understanding of empathy, and putting those two together in figuring out an ethical way of relating to otherness.
Really interesting. I think this is really important because rather than feeling with something, a sort of fundamental ethics of respect, which built in the difference between us, is one of the things that's being suggested here.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating how these problems, which seem to be, as you were saying, current day problems or problems inherent in our way of thinking about other people, are really problems that are more, or equally inherent in our way of thinking about relationship to otherness as such, right? So in that sense, they're philosophical and ethical problems that go way, way back and point to, I think, fundamental questions or questions and issues of what it means to be in the world as beings, right? Which really encompass so much of our thinking. And so it's interesting how starting by looking at the development of a 19th century aesthetic term suddenly ends up opening out onto all sorts of philosophical and ethical questions that are at stake, right, in the development of these kind of terms.
So let's go all the way out if we're going to be going there. You mentioned this earlier, but one of the really fascinating questions you raise, both throughout the book, but especially at the end, you come back to this, is the whole question of the dualism that's presupposed by empathy. You know as well as I do, there are other ways of thinking about dualism, and the non-duality that Buddhists talk about, the refusal to start, or the insistence that you don't necessarily need to start with a subject-object dichotomy or dualism, is fundamental to all kinds of Buddhism. I know you're deeply aware of this. Is empathy one of those shadow problems that's created by a category mistake?
It's an interesting question, and I would say it's in one way a loaded question because it's very complicated to think through how to answer that. I would say, from one perspective, yes, it's a shadow problem, but it depends on what perspective you're looking at. So you mentioned Buddhism. I mean, one sort of key philosophical doctrine or way of thinking, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, is the notion of the two truths, right? Relative and ultimate. And there are a lot of different ways to think about this, and it would be way too complicated to go into it in detail here. But one sort of simple, thumbnail or reduced way of thinking about it is that relative truth might be thought of as the way that things appear, right? The way that things appear to, let's say, human beings in the world. We see objects in the world. We take there to be other people or other beings with whom we're interacting. We tend to divide our sort of experiential field into subjects and objects. This would all belong to what we would call relative truth, whereas ultimate truth would be sort of the way that reality appears from a perspective that has sort of seen through those sorts of category distinctions that beings tend to make in the phenomenological world, so to speak, and sort of is looking at things from a more universal perspective. And I would say from that perspective, from the perspective of ultimate truth, there one might say, yeah, empathy and dualism are both shadow problems because they don't really exist, right? They're a mode of perception that doesn't correspond to reality, where everything is sort of all part of the same field that's in flux, right? Even if you think of it in terms of physics, where does one object really end and another one really begin, right? In all the sorts of quantum and subatomic relations, can we really tell at a certain scale of the universe where one thing begins and one thing ends? Or is there just one flux field, so to speak? Whereas at the relative level, yes, we're having this conversation. I'm sitting across from you. So I would say at the relative level, we do need to take into consideration both how to relate to another, trying to understand empathically what they might be thinking or feeling, and also respecting their otherness and their difference, the way that they are an entity that we can never fully unpack, so to speak. They exist in their own reality space. So at the relative level, I think those things are issues we need to work through ethically. At the ultimate level, yes, in a way, the category distinctions themselves have imposed the problem, and we're chasing our tails trying to solve something that at a deeper level may not really exist.
But the important non-dualist point is that form is emptiness, but emptiness is form.
Emptiness is
to choose one as the ultimate reality is to make the mistake of dualism.
Yes, no, and that's a very important point as well. And thank you very much for mentioning that. That's the Heart Sutra, which absolutely, right, there's a common error to drift onto one side or the other, right? And to sort of only get stuck on the universal perspective, which can even lead to the mistake that nothing matters because everything is quote unquote one, right? Or to be stuck on the relative level, everything is the way it appears. Everything is dualistic in that way, right? Whereas even the two truths are not dualistic. One is the other. And in that sense, they are both equally operative, right? Which is a difficult concept to get one's mind around, right?
And they're always turning into the other. It's continual change.
Yes.
This is great, Joe. I'm so glad we got from zombies to Buddhism. This is a really, really wonderful book. It is an academic book, I will tell our listeners, but one that is absolutely fascinating, full of really great detail. I'll also say from my perspective as a literary historian, your work with Stifter is fascinating. This sort of other Stifter you've uncovered who does not fulfill a lot of the expected idealism or realism, I guess, in the German context, that some people might have expected that the traditional Stifter is absolutely fascinating. So go read Stifter and then go read Joe's new account of him. He's really one of the lost greats of European literature. Is there anything we haven't covered that you would like our listeners to know about the book and the project?
Thank you for all of these incredibly probing questions and for the chance to talk about the book. I would say, for anybody who might be interested in reading it, I guess one takeaway that I would hope people would get out of it is just the pleasure of reading. I think that, one of the things that I was hoping to do and that I sort of experienced when I was writing it, and I would hope readers would get this as well, is the book kind of tells a story, but it interweaves all sorts of things. It's moving back and forth between close readings of particular images in literary texts, and then these voices from empathy theory and physiology, and these voices from other sorts of theories like affect theory having to do with emotion and intensity of physical feeling, and philosophy, etc. And they don't unfold in a purely linear way. You start at one point and it sort of takes you to this point and to that point. You're kind of moving through a field, and each of the various voices has their own cadences and their own sort of register and tone, right? The book is called The Feeling of the Form, and reading it is kind of like feeling the form. You're sort of, hopefully the reader would get a sense of pleasure moving from voice to voice and feeling the different weight and the different energy of the voices and how they interact. And so I would say, yeah, I hope it would be a pleasurable experience just feeling the form of the book.
And it is. I really, really did enjoy reading it. And I think it's really important methodologically as an example of a nonlinear cultural history that really depends on a deep sensitivity to the text in front of you in a way that can allow us to recognize the echoes of all these different times in one place. You've been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our music is Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.